Welcome to Playback. As we say hello to 2022, we'll have a look back at the most important stories that captured headlines in 2021. In the second year of the COVID-19 pandemic, cases are still on the rise around the world. Hotter temperatures, stronger floods, and larger wildfires. Natural disasters intensified last year, forcing countries to confront the climate crisis. And we will look back at the migration crisis that's been fueled by both natural and man-made causes. Now, the COVID-19 pandemic is still raging on despite vaccinations and new methods of treatment. Case numbers surged the record numbers in the last weeks of 2021, especially in Europe. Our correspondent Simon McGregor-Wood looks back at how the continent fought and failed to contain the virus.
While the UK managed a fast national vaccine rollout at the start of the year, the rest of Europe was slow to get going. The EU was in charge, and there were delays in signing contracts and approving the vaccines. There was a bitter dispute with AstraZeneca over delivery schedules, and some EU leaders cast doubt on its efficacy. Concerns about rare blood clots led to countries restricting its use. In March, just as vaccination rates were picking up, the Delta variant, first identified in India, arrived in Europe.
We see that the new Delta variant is much more transmissible than the other ones, and we see that infection rates are rising, and we know they will be rising.
Case numbers remained manageable through the summer as European economies cautiously reopened. But in parts of Central and Eastern Europe, vaccination rates remained stubbornly low. In Romania, only 37% of the population was fully vaccinated. In Bulgaria, only 25%. As autumn arrived, infection rates rose. Across Europe, governments started to reintroduce strict measures, including restrictions on the unvaccinated and partial lockdowns. These provoked protests, sometimes violent, like this in the centre of Brussels.
Basically because we want our freedom, and being injected by something that's not tested well, being not able to work where you want to work, to be where you want to be, that's not where we stand for. That's not freedom, that's not where we live. We live in West Europe, and we just want to be free like we were before.
Across Europe, vaccine skeptics and anti-lockdown activists found common ground. Even in Germany, waning immunity saw cases rise and hospitals under strain.
If you have an emergency, like a stroke or a heart attack, the facilities you need are not available. That is dire, and that is a situation we always wanted to avoid.
In late November, the arrival of the Omicron variant and its multiple mutations threatened to make matters worse. While scientists tried to find out how bad it might be, new travel restrictions were imposed. Governments rushed to roll out booster shots. And across the continent, new restrictions were imposed on the unvaccinated. The idea of compulsory vaccination took hold, and public protests continued.
What is the bottom line? Hope for the best, prepare for the worst.
Despite its relative wealth and the sophistication of its health systems, Europe started the year as one of the worst affected regions in the world. It may end it in the same way. Simon McGregor-Wood, TRT World.
The number and intensity of extreme weather events this year shattered records. But amid the destruction, there's also hope. As Sarah Morris reports, this year's UN climate conference may not have delivered all that was wished for, but it does leave the world with a fighting chance.
To quote the UN Secretary-General, this year the world was delivered a code red for humanity, and just about every corner of the globe felt it. Wildfires raged across Europe, wreaking havoc in Turkey, Greece and Italy. The continent was also inundated by floods. 170 people died in Germany in the country's worst natural disaster in decades. In the Arctic, Siberia experienced its hottest day on record, with the mercury rising to 38 degrees Celsius. And in Canada, a heatwave left 569 people dead, with temperatures reaching 49.6 degrees Celsius in British Columbia, nearly 5 degrees hotter than the previous high.
I think that this year has actually been an annus horribilis. We always see natural disasters around the world every year, but this year has been particularly bad.
Large tornado, large tornado.
And it didn't stop there. Several deadly hurricanes and tornadoes swept across the US. China's Henan province was drenched by more than a year's worth of rain in just 3 days, causing catastrophic flooding. And in Kenya, along with other parts of East Africa, a locust plague devastated crops and farmland.
We must learn from these types of disasters. We're not ready for them. We've seen that people didn't have the warnings they needed for the floods, for the fires, for the tornadoes. We really need to get people out of the way of these terrible hazards that are coming towards us.
In November, people on the front line of the climate crisis joined world leaders and scientists at the UN's COP26 conference in Glasgow. In a landmark, although watered-down deal, around 200 countries agreed to start phasing down the use of fossil fuels and coal and committed to increasing pledges to reduce emissions next year. But critics say the agreement didn't go far enough.
I think definitely not enough, but there was a lot of cause for hope coming out of Glasgow. I think we went into Glasgow with some momentum from Paris 6 years before, and we come out of Glasgow with more momentum. There's commitment for countries to go faster on their targets. There's commitments for countries to double climate adaptation, for example, but there are some big gaps in terms of the finance that was promised to developing nations.
For many people who attended COP26, the final agreement was disappointing. But there are signs of progress. Before the Paris Accord in 2015, the world was on track to heat up by nearly 4 degrees. Now we're heading for 2.4 degrees. Still too high, but a clear improvement. Sarah Morris, TRT World.
Now, another story that continued to unfold throughout the year was the migration crisis. Tens of thousands of people fled their homelands to seek better lives, often traveling huge distances through dangerous conditions. The UN estimates almost 4,500 migrants died globally in 2021. Our correspondent Mehmet Solmaz reported on some of the deadliest routes.
It's okay, it's okay, it's okay.
These people may have had a rough journey, but they made it to the Italian coast, unlike the estimated 1,600 migrants who died or went missing in the Mediterranean Sea this year. The Mediterranean remained the most common route to Europe, although the number of refugees and migrants transiting in mostly unseaworthy boats had been decreasing since 2015. But this year, the figures shot back up, with about 113,000 people successfully crossing to reach Europe, according to the United Nations. It's been cause for alarm in Brussels, but the bloc was caught unprepared for another shift in the migration landscape. In the autumn, thousands of migrants and asylum seekers assembled at the Poland-Belarus border. Critics of Belarusian President Alexander Lukashenko say his government helped them to cross EU borders. Retaliation against the bloc after it accused him of election fraud and imposed sanctions. Lukashenko acknowledged some of his forces may have helped migrants to cross into EU member states, Latvia, Lithuania and Poland. About 37,000 people made it into EU through Belarus, but still by the end of the year, in brutally cold weather, an estimated 7,000 remain stranded between the Poland-Belarus border, waiting for a crossing opportunity.
You will be returned to Belarus and banned from entering Poland and other European countries for 3 years. If you cross the border, you will be met with our strong reaction.
In 2022, France will take charge of the EU presidency. President Emmanuel Macron says France's term will focus on building a more sovereign Europe, promising to make external border security a priority, a policy that goes down well with the European electorate.
A sovereign Europe, for me, has the foremost aspect of being capable to keep its borders under control. We have seen it again in the last couple of weeks with the crisis we have experienced at Europe's eastern borders, at the Lithuanian and Latvian border from late summer, then at the Polish border.
But with the global economy lagging due to the pandemic, that's unlikely to be an easy task. And refugees in France say Brexit has made it easier for them to cross into the UK. According to the official figures, in 2019, Just over 1,800 people entered the UK from France via the English Channel. In 2021, the number increased to 25,700, a 14-fold increase in just 2 years. In November, a boat capsized in the Channel on its way to the UK, killing at least 27 people, underscoring the deadly nature of these journeys. France and Britain blamed each other for the incident, with Prime Minister Boris Johnson tweeting a letter to Macron, calling on the EU to allow the UK to return migrants to the bloc. But with the end of the first shocks of the pandemic and the ongoing economic instability it's left in its wake, especially in poorer countries, migrants and asylum seekers aren't likely to abandon their dream of finding a better life by risking their lives. Mehmet Solmaz, TRT World.
Moving on to the United States now, 2021 has been a year of transition from the presidency of Donald Trump to the rise of Joe Biden. It's also been a year of controversy, including one of the most shocking episodes of violence in modern U.S. political history. Our North America correspondent John Brain has this report.
I, Joseph Robinette Biden Jr., do solemnly swear
that I will faithfully execute.
That I will faithfully execute.
A new year, a new president.
So help me God.
Congratulations, Mr. President.
Joe Biden's inauguration was heralded as a new chapter, an opportunity for the US to move on from the controversy of the Trump era. But his predecessor had other ideas, and arguably the most significant event of 2021 had already happened 14 days earlier.
Fight for Trump! Fight for Trump!
Refusing to accept that Trump had lost the election, thousands of his supporters descended on Washington on January the 6th, clearly emboldened by a speech from the man himself.
You'll never take back our country with weakness. You have to show strength and you have to be strong.
At first, the gathering was peaceful, but it quickly descended into anarchy as hundreds of protesters forced their way into the Capitol building. American democracy survived, but it was profoundly shaken. The new president struggled to seize the agenda in the way Trump had done. He wasn't helped by his, at times, unconvincing delivery.
Today's historic drop in unemployment rate includes dramatic improvements for workers who have often seen higher wages and higher levels of unemployment. Higher levels of unemployment. They are receiving higher wages.
And his policies had mixed success. The administration failed to get to grips with the migrant crisis on the southern border. And the withdrawal from Afghanistan was a disaster.
The exit from Afghanistan did not go well, and you always have to plan for the worst possible outcome when human lives are at stake, especially, and so that would be an example of a low point. But on the other hand, Biden has achieved truly historic accomplishments already with these infrastructure investments, which rank really with Franklin Roosevelt so far.
Biden also fulfilled a pledge to ramp up COVID vaccination, and he oversaw an upturn in the economy. But his poll ratings have been sinking. The Republicans are expected to retake control of Congress next year. That could make it virtually impossible for Biden to get any new legislation passed. What happened here on January the 6th has cast a long shadow over 2021. Any new leader can have a tough first year in office, but a majority of Republican voters still believe the November 2020 election was rigged, and they don't consider Joe Biden their legitimate president. That's a real problem for this nation.
The situation in the country, I think, continues to get more serious, and we must appreciate that democracy is in crisis. And all of us who believe in democracy, whether we're Republicans, Democrats, independent, or something else, need to stand up for it.
The United States ends 2021 as divided under Biden as it was under Trump the previous year. There are few signs that 2022 will be any different. John Brain, TRT World, Washington.
And another major change in U.S. policy was its withdrawal from Afghanistan after 20 years. The Taliban swept back into power with surprising speed, but the group has since struggled to govern the skeptical citizens and revive the collapsing economy. From Kabul, Soraya Lenny has more.
It was a seismic shift in Central Asia, the speed of which even the best intelligence agencies failed to predict.
Is a Taliban takeover of Afghanistan now inevitable?
No, it is not.
After 2 decades in Afghanistan, the US-led mission withdrew its forces. The government it backed in Kabul collapsed, and the Taliban moved into the capital.
Taliban fighters behind the desk of the presidential palace.
As the Taliban had taken city after city, President Ashraf Ghani refused to acknowledge the crisis.
Our security plan is clear. I don't want to discuss it in detail here. All I can say is that we have made all the preparations to put an end to this wave of insurrection in next 6 months and reach a state of stability.
Less than 2 weeks after this address, Ghani fled the country. It was the final act of an unpopular leader criticised for promoting ethnic divisions and nepotism. Many Afghans say the Ghani government was the final nail in the coffin for the struggling republic.
One is obviously legitimacy, and there are many components to legitimacy. One is just performance. Then there were actually issue of representations, how the government failed to include different segments of society. Then there are issues of outright corruption, just predatory behavior by the political class.
Many Afghans, like Haji Wahidullah, also blamed the so-called war on terror for undermining the state. The US and its allies fought most of that war in rural areas, including where Wahidullah lives.
The Afghan government and U.S. forces conducted a lot of night operations here, and we know how they oppressed us and created such fear among normal people. Even talking about it makes you feel sad. These operations caused people to hate the government.
There may now be a restive peace, but there's also a growing humanitarian crisis. And without international funding to prop up the state, the economy is collapsing. The Taliban has made the situation worse by forcing many women from their jobs.
It's not fair to feel like a second-class gender. It makes you suicidal because it means you were born to simply be financially dependent on someone else and you're just nothing.
Shagayeg Tawangar is one of Afghanistan's most promising young journalists. She says without women, any Taliban rule is illegitimate.
I think Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan has no positive thinking when it comes to the activities of women, especially media. But still, I'm hopeful. The world is in progress, and the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan have to be at the same level.
As the sun sets on so many dreams, no other government has recognized the Taliban's legitimacy. But foreign policy is far from the minds of many Afghans, who are now simply trying to survive. They have a new government, a new reality, and an uncertain new year. Soraya Lenny, TRT World, Kabul.
For 11 days in the month of May, Palestinian factions in Gaza were in a state of war against Israel. They eventually agreed to a ceasefire, but as Mustafa Fatih Yavuz reports, the trauma and hostility between the two sides continues to divide the region.
Palestinians gathering at the Damascus Gate, one of the main entrances to Jerusalem's Old City. It was the holy month of Ramadan and Muslim worshippers were protesting against police barricades that prevented them from gathering in the plaza.
They do not want us to pray. There's a fight every day. Every day there are clashes. Every day there are troubles. They've been stopping us from entering inside the old city for a whole week. Why? They did not allow us in yesterday. Why? Why are they doing this to us? They're making us crazy. They're making us explode. Look at how they're firing at us. How can we live?
Over the next few days, tensions escalated. Israeli police stormed the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound, injuring more than 200 Palestinians. At the same time, Sheikh Jarrah was another scene of protest. Part of an ongoing property dispute, an Israeli court had handed down eviction orders to 12 Palestinian families living in the occupied East Jerusalem neighborhood. The court claimed that their houses belonged to Jewish settlers, even though the Palestinians had been there for generations.
We are not many. They can send us from here. But look, the whole world supports us. The people from the West Bank, the Arabs are behind us. After May, more than 1,500 demonstrations in America alone to support us. Everyone agrees and says no to the Israeli occupation.
Hamas issued a warning to Israel, calling for a stop to police assaults on Al-Aqsa. But on the 10th of May, war broke out. Palestinian factions in Gaza fired rockets into Israel, and Israel responded with airstrikes. Over the next 11 days, residential and commercial tower blocks in Gaza were flattened, as well as police and security buildings. Hundreds were killed or injured. The violence triggered by the events in Aqsa and Sheikh Jarrah wasn't limited to war between Israel and Palestinian factions in Gaza. It also led to deadly clashes between Palestinian and Jewish citizens of Israel in mixed towns like this one, the city of Lod. In May, Palestinian residents of Lod took to the streets to protest against the Israeli air assault on Gaza and police violence against Palestinians in occupied East Jerusalem. It wasn't long before those protests turned violent. At least 5 synagogues, Palestinian shops, a mosque, a Muslim cemetery and at least 1 Jewish school were vandalized by both Jewish and Palestinian rioters. Violence shook the already fragile coexistence between the two communities.
I think what happened is that it showed that the coexistence that has been the norm until 2021 has been built on an asymmetric relationship of the Jews being dominant and the Jews tolerating the Arab presence. And that is not a healthy way of coexistence. Coexistence should be a relationship of equals where both sides feel they have equal opportunities to fulfill themselves within society.
In May, Israeli and Palestinian leaders gave orders to attack. 11 days later, with 12 Israelis and 260 Palestinians dead, no problems have been solved. Only new wounds added. Mustafa Fatih's Theatre World, occupied East Jerusalem.
In Lebanon, the 2020 Beirut port blast was thought to be a historic low point for the country. But since then, it's been hit by a series of economic and political crises that have pushed the government and the people even deeper into turmoil. Imogen Kimber reports.
2021 began with another lockdown, thanks to a spike in COVID-19 cases. Already suffering through an economic crisis, people could ill afford to miss work. But Lebanon's hospitals were struggling. COVID-19 exacerbated an already growing healthcare crisis.
If one bed empties, there is another patient who has been waiting in the emergency room for 3 to 4 days to come up to the ICU. It is tiring. The health sector is not good at all anymore.
Medical supplies were running out, and soon medical professionals, unable to do their jobs and underpaid thanks to the 80% devaluation of the local currency, began to leave. But they were some of the lucky ones. For most, with food prices rising by 400% and the currency continuing its plunge, getting out was an impossible dream.
We are here to say enough to the collapse. The current authority is not up to the responsibility to stop the collapse.
The summer brought chronic fuel shortages.
The situation is really difficult. I've been waiting here for an hour and a half. Maybe they will still have petrol by the time it's my turn. Maybe not. The situation is unbearable.
Electricity cuts hit more than 20 hours a day, and the worsening medicine shortages took lives, all caused by a homegrown financial crisis. In August, less than 2 weeks after the first anniversary of the catastrophic Beirut port explosion, at least 33 people were killed in another blast as they tried to get fuel from a tanker. In September, after 13 months of political infighting, the country finally regained a functioning government.
It took some time for the government to be formed. Nothing is perfect, but I assure you, our team will work as one, so that we stop this collapse and stop the despair.
But it immediately faced unrest. In scenes reminiscent of the Civil War, violence broke out in the streets. 7 were killed, when rival factions traded gunfire for more than 4 hours, after tensions surrounding the investigation into the port explosion boiled over. As the year draws to an end, the Lebanese can only hope for stability and economic recovery. But many hold little hope it will come anytime soon. Imogen Kimber, TRT World, Beirut.
And a monumental milestone in astronomy. NASA has launched the world's largest and most powerful space telescope ever.
And liftoff. Décollage, liftoff from a tropical rainforest to the edge of time itself. James Webb begins a voyage back.
It's essentially a window into the distant past. The James Webb Space Telescope is on a mission to investigate faint infrared signals coming from the first galaxies that formed billions of years ago. If all goes well, the first images from the $10 billion telescope should be available in about 6 months. That rounds up the 2021 review of news here on Playback. Stay tuned to TRT World for the latest stories.